Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of You've Got Potential. I'm Liesel,
I'm Paula.
I'm Natasha.
and today we have with us a very special guest, Faiza. Thank you for joining us. So, I know you from lab actually. So, could you tell us a little bit more about how you got into the lab and like what you're currently doing?
Yeah. Me and Liesel actually are placed in the same lab. Both work with CLEF Lab on Bush campus. I've been working with them since last summer. So since the summer after my sophomore year, because I'm ending my junior year right now. And I got involved through something called Project Super, which is a program with the Douglas Residential Women's College. And it's basically just a program to try to get women interested in STEM. And what it basically does is you apply through Project Super first, and you just tell them like your major, your interests, things like that, and what kind of research you'd be interested in doing, and they match you with a PI in a lab from there. So that was like super interesting. I honestly wasn't seeking out research like specifically. I kind of didn't know much about like what research opportunities existed for undergrads because I graduated in 2020. So my senior year was COVID and my freshman year was COVID. So like I wasn't involved on campus. I didn't know what opportunities there were. And then I took, I believe it's a leadership class with the Douglas College. And they had like towards the end of the fall semester, they had someone come and speak about what opportunities like Rutgers has and Douglas has. And she mentioned Project Super. And that was like the first time I realized that like undergrads could really do research like that. So yeah, and then I applied from there.
Yeah, thank you for telling us about those programs because I definitely relate to that too. I think all of us here graduated like during high school during the COVID year, and so entering Rutgers, and such a huge school, it's a little like overwhelming to find what's out there. But I'm really glad that you had those opportunities and that someone came to talk to you about those opportunities.
What made you choose a specific lab? Like what did you look into? Because you said before with Project Super that you had a couple labs that you were matched with. Yeah, so CLEF Lab, they're a neuroscience and psychology lab, and they do research in like the auditory system with learning and behavior and memory and a bunch of different projects regarding that. Through Project Super, I got matched with like a couple labs, and I like interviewed with the PIs and the mentors from there. I only in-person interviewed with one other lab, and I think he was mainly doing like biochemistry and things like that. But what personally like didn't attract me to that one that much is they were doing a lot of computational things, which of course is like so important and a big part of research and a big part of like developing results. But I think for me, especially as someone who had like no experience in a lab, do like interviewing with a computational lab versus CLEF lab, which of course, like in any research, you have computational and data analysis. But when I saw that they were doing like behavioral training and things like that, and like in vivo surgeries, that was something that like really enticed me there specifically because it was like things that I just had absolutely like no experience with, no idea that like was happening. Like when I interviewed and they like were walking me through the lab and showing me like, oh yeah, this is where we put the animal in and we teach them the sounds, and this is our surgery booth, and this is this. I was like, what is this place? Like, this is crazy. Especially with someone who had like no experience of like what undergrad research really is. So I think as like a first time student, that's really what like kind of enticed me to CLEF Lab. And I've always been very interested in neuroscience. So that stood out to me. And yeah, I just loved the projects they were working on. I read some of Dr. Chad's, which is the PI. She had some, like, a lot of her researches focuses on HDAC inhibition and how that could affect learning and memory. And I kind of read that before I like walked in, even though it was very hard to understand as someone who had no like background in it. But I just thought the fact that like there was something that could even affect learning and memory like blew my mind. And I just thought the work that they were doing was super cool.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, it's so fascinating, I feel like neuroscience in particular because there's just so much that we don't know yet. And like such complex things like how we learn, how we remember things. It's really cool that there's people actively working to figure that out. And it's really cool you get to be a part of that. Um, so what specifically is your projects about?
Yeah, so when I first started with CLEF Lab, I was working on a project that was called, it was basically trying to develop a new protocol for figuring out cortical areas based on their function rather than location. We finished that project now, but basically what it was is now researchers, a lot of the times when they want to do any kind of molecular analysis or anything, not just specifically what in our lab, what they need to do is identify their cortex of interest. For us, that's the auditory cortex, but it could vary. And when researchers want to find a cortex for collection, what they use is something called a brain atlas, which is kind of just a picture that looks like a 2D map that has like the just little boxes of all the cortexes in relation to each other. And researchers just basically have to go off of that. So like they'll look at the map, they'll see where the auditory cortex should be and just punch out their region of interest or take it from there. And a lot of times the problems are once they take what they think their cortex of interest is and they go downstream to sequence it or things like that, since the brain is so kind of precise and since a lot of times in your model organism, the brain is pretty small, you could not actually be like taking the cortex that you think you are. So since they are cortexes and their brain and they have function, we try to identify it based on function, not just the map location. So we would perform like a craniotomy onto our animal, where we would like take out a part of the cranium. So the approximate location of the auditory cortex would be visible. And then we would put in electrodes, which are just like electric prons that pick up on brain signals. And since we're interested on the auditory cortex, we'd play a set of sounds or like pure tones. And the idea is that the sounds, even though the animal is anesthetized, their brain would still be responding to sound. And based on the like real-time data that we're getting from the electrodes, we'd know whether we're in the auditory cortex or not. So we kind of moved the electrodes around until we saw that we were in the auditory cortex. And once we did, we would stain it with like an electrofluorescent dye, which is just basically a dye that like glows under our microscope. And in doing that, we could then like stitch up the animal. And then days later, we could do like any training that we wanted within those days. And once it gets time to collect your region or your cortex, like that area would already be dyed. So you would know exactly where your cortex is. And yeah, it was basically just trying to figure out a way to like improve on a common problem for any like other downstream experiments that we may need to do.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, what you described, it kind of reminds me like when you have like a metal detector and you're just trying to like
Yeah.
move it around and find if like, oh, is there something here? And if it makes a sound, then like, oh, I'm in the right area. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's good that you're like taking a process and like making things easier because I feel like sometimes it's not always like discovering a new thing. It's also like improving on like what already exists and just finding new ways to do things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would make discovering new things so much easier, so much faster. Because I'm sure there's a lot of like people in our lab and other labs who have like gotten to a point of where they put so much time into their project and then realize that they maybe don't have the cells they thought they did or the cortex that they thought they did are not such a viable sample. And that just delays like any type of discovery or learning or anything. So yeah, sometimes just the tech like improving better techniques can make so much of a difference in like so many different realms, not just like specifically your project, which I thought was cool.
Yeah. Well, that's really great that you have something that could be applied to like any sort of method or protocol. But yeah, so you mentioned that was your last project. So have you moved on to like a different project or something continuing with that sort of functional thing?
Yeah, so this semester we're actually doing a completely different project. Still obviously surrounding around like neuroscience, auditory system, and memory. Now we're actually working with a cohort of mice who have a knock-in gene which is called like an APP mutation, which is basically a mutation that in humans is linked to Alzheimer's disease and familial dementia.
So this gene is knocked into the genome of the mice, and our cohort has some like wild type, some heterozygous, some homozygous for the mutation. And what we're basically doing is trying to sound train them. So in our lab, like Lisa knows, we have like a little booth that has a lever, and once you press the lever, you can get water. So we're basically trying to train these mice, or rats, I'm sorry, that when a certain frequency tone, in our case, the 5 kilohertz plays, then they're allowed to press the bar and get water. And when a different tone, the 11.5 plays, and they press the bar, they get no water. So they kind of just have to learn over extended period of time how to differentiate a low frequency and a high frequency tone. And throughout that process and after, what we do with the rats is we do auditory brainstem recordings, which they're anesthetized, and we're recording from their auditory brainstem while those sounds are playing. Because like I mentioned before, even though they're anesthetized, their brain is still responding to the sound. And based on the responses that we're getting after learning, before learning, and during, we're basically trying to compare the like homozygous for the gene and the heterozygous and the wild type to see if there's any correlation between that gene and learning, and to see how that gene, if it does play a significant role in like dementia and learning, if it also affects auditory learning specifically. So just kind of trying to understand that gene and the way it works more.
Yeah, that's really cool. That we're able to have like disease models
Yeah.
to like really study this stuff. And my question is, I guess we are like a learning and memory specifically for auditory stuff or sounds. Is there a connection between Alzheimer's and like sound learning? Because I feel like most people, when they think about Alzheimer's and like the effects and stuff, um, I feel like sound isn't really one that's well known. So
Yeah.
could you talk more about that?
Yeah, that's basically what we're trying to establish. Like you said, a lot of people don't think of it, and there hasn't been a lot of research specifically regarding like dementia and Alzheimer's to auditory learning. I know my mentor mentioned briefly before that there are some links to actually autism and auditory learning. So there has been like some talk about the way auditory processing can affect like neurological behaviors and neurological disabilities and diseases. But yeah, we know obviously that Alzheimer's disease affects learning and memory, like in its essence, but trying to figure out like what mechanism, if it'll affect the way you like remember auditory stimuli, or if it's just like long-term memory, things like that. That's like what the project's basically about, trying to figure out if it is any link.
So I'm just curious, did you come into college like wanting to do research, or like did this experience kind of make you more interested in it?
Yeah, so I originally came into college as thinking I was going to go on the pharmacy track. And then I kind of didn't change my major yet, but I decided like maybe I don't want to be pre-pharmacy. And then I looked around for majors and I switched to genetics because that was something I was really interested in. And then I landed on pre-med, which is still kind of what I'm leaning towards right now. This was all before, like, honestly, I didn't even know really what like getting your PhD or going to grad school for something like research was. And I feel like that's also an issue that like there's not a lot of awareness on that right now. It's not like such a kind of talked about career path outside of academia and outside of like the college space, unless you're really in it, like you don't know the opportunities it has. But yeah, I always knew that I was going to do something like in science, in health, somewhere in that realm. But yeah, it's all about like just the experiences I got that kind of showed me about other opportunities.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so going off of that, since research wasn't exactly a thing that you had planned to do, I mean, now that you have plenty of research experience and you've gotten to do some really cool projects, how would you say that research has changed you or affected you? Has it like altered your career path, or did you learn about a specific field that you might be interested in pursuing in the future?
Mm-hmm. Honestly, learning about research and having firsthand experience has made me consider like pursuing a PhD and pursuing a master's a lot. I still haven't decided like whether I want to become a physician or whether I want to get my PhD or both. But I think just like seeing the way that my PIs and my mentors like think and decide and like create their projects really like made me think more analytically and really just opened me up to like how science is actually done, and how like it's really just normal people who ask the question and like figure it out, like, and that's really like just that being done repeatedly and repeatedly, whereas where these like amazing findings are coming from. Like it's not some mysterious place that is just finding out scientific laws and giving it to us. Like it just takes one person to ask a question, and I think that was like the most impactful thing that I learned.
Speaking of like the people in your lab, just seeing how they interact and how they think, what is the environment like?
So my lab like environment could not be better. I feel like everyone there was so welcoming, especially like when I first started and I kind of was like felt like out of place, like, oh my God, everyone's so smart. Everyone's like, they just always were there to like answer any question I had. They were always like really interested in like what I wanted to do, my career paths, like what I was thinking. And my mentor specifically is Dr. Aishagul Aiden, and I think she has been great because she doesn't only like explain things to me, but she also kind of like makes me think and makes me like, you know, come up with the answers myself a little bit, like which has only like made me understand things more. And yeah, I think also the other undergrads like Liesel in my lab have been amazing, like Liesel, Jessica, everyone. I think it's been a great experience.
That's awesome. It sounds like you're really happy in this lab, which is great. So going forward into the future, I mean, as we think about like senior year, which is crazy to think about already. So do you have any future ideas or plans for like what you want to do in the lab, and continue research?
Yeah, so I plan to stay in the lab until I graduate. Like originally my project super placement was only supposed to be for that summer. But I enjoyed it so much and I enjoyed the lab and like what we were doing so much that I stayed on. And yeah, I really 100% like plan to stay there as long as I can. But yeah, so I'm just gonna be continuing working with my mentor, Aishagul. Yeah, so whatever project she has, we're gonna be working on this project, the Alzheimer's project for a little bit longer that hasn't wrapped up yet. And then yeah, whatever she has next, I'll be there.
To anyone who was in your position before where they weren't sure like what research is like, what advice would you have for them if they're thinking about doing research or like not sure about which lab they want to join based on your experience?
Yeah, I would just honestly tell them to, first of all, not be intimidated, because I know it can be very intimidating, joining a lab or even like reaching out to people or even thinking like, can I even help? Like, would a lab even want me to do research with them? I think the first step is, yeah, not being intimidated. And also personally, what the advice I give people whenever they ask me like how to get involved with research is try to find a program like Project Super or RESTI or things like that, that might be able to help you get placed in a lab. Because I did have a point when I heard about research where I like cold emailed a couple professors, and I'm sure a lot of people know like that could be very hard. It does work for people, but I think having a combination of like just looking up the PIs and the people doing research at Rutgers or at your university and trying to find someone that interests you and emailing them, in addition to maybe finding out research programs, can really help you. And yeah, and then once you get there, just take it day by day and not be intimidated. From my experience and like the experience I've heard from a lot of other undergrads, everyone there is pretty understanding. Like they've probably been in your position before. If they're pursuing like a career in science or academia before, they had some experience where they were the undergrad, where they maybe didn't know as much and they had a mentor and they had a PI. Like they understand, and honestly they're excited themselves to like be able to teach someone, be able to have helping hands. So yeah, I think just go for it and don't be scared about it.
That's really awesome advice. Thank you. I could not have said it better myself. Um, yeah, any other questions, Paula, Natasha?
What has been your favorite part about being an undergrad researcher?
I think my favorite part has been being able to talk to other people doing research. And now that I have like some kind of understanding with, reading different papers and the research I'm doing, the research like we talk about, really just being more comfortable with like understanding the research that other people are doing. And I think it's so cool when like I find someone that maybe I didn't know previously, but like we find out we're both doing research and we both can talk about our project and like just instantly connect. And like the fact that we both just have like such a good grasp on like what we're talking about has been my favorite part. Cause like I said before, like this was kind of something that I didn't know existed within undergrad science as much. And I think like now it's like a little community of us that are interested in research and love science. So that's been cool.
That's really cool. Yeah, as somebody who doesn't do lab research, like it's cool to know that there's like a whole community of people that kind of help each other out.
Yeah.
What are some ways that someone can connect to others who are doing research, like fellow students who are doing research? How would you suggest like people reach out to that community?
Well, you could watch the You've Got Potential podcast and see who they've had on. But also, I think I've kind of just ran into people like through my classes. If you're taking a lot of STEM classes, you could just talk to people in your class, be like, hey, is anyone doing research? There's also like courses that are for people trying to get like into research. Like I know me and Lisa are actually peer mentors for Introduction to Scientific Research course with the Douglas College, and that's connected to Project Super, but that's just literally like a whole room of people who are getting into research for the first time. And I hope that like through the years as they continue in research, like they'll all know each other, which will be great. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of like clubs on campus that have to do with like STEM involvement, people who are interested in that. So I'm sure there's a lot of communities there. And it's just like talking to people, knowing the right people, things like that. Just putting yourself out there in general, I think has been the theme of this.
Yeah, so you mentioned like the peer mentor course. I think that's a interesting like way that people can also get involved in research, just like being a part of like a course that shows you the things. And also being a mentor. What has that been like for you? Because now it's like you're further along in your journey of like being an undergraduate researcher, and it's just really cool that you have an opportunity to sort of give back and like inspire the next generation.
Yeah, it's been great being a mentor so far. One of the students in that course has actually works in our lab. So it's been great to like talk to her and answer questions for her, like anything that she's concerned about, and honestly just encourage her and let her know like I was in your position only like literally 10 months ago. Like you're gonna catch on so quick, like you're gonna love it here. I wish I had like someone like that when I joined, because since I joined in the summer, there was like barely any undergrads working in my lab. So I think that also like was intimidating when I started. So I think being able to just be someone that like the other undergrads getting introduced to research could like message at any time, and just something as simple like, oh, do you know, like I have to ask my PI this, like do you know which way I could say it, like just those little things can give someone like more confidence and help them. So yeah, it's been a great experience. I'm lucky and happy that I could do it.
You also mentioned that like the Project Super, the Introduction to Scientific Research course, it's through Douglas College, correct? And in case you don't know, Douglas College caters specifically towards women. And so I think that's a great opportunity, especially there's an alternative to other like research programs, especially if you fit into that demographic. So could you talk about like what your experience in STEM and research has been like as a woman? Has that affected your journey or shaped it in some way?
Yeah, I think most of the kind of challenges of being a woman in STEM have gotten a lot better, thankfully. But I think it is something that like we're always aware of as women in like a male dominated field. In my lab specifically, we're actually mostly women. So that's great. But I think I've mostly noticed it in STEM classes a little bit. I feel like a lot of women could relate to maybe not like being respected as much by male classmates, not any faculty or anything. But the most thing I've noticed is kind of the mansplaining, like I would ask like a little question in class and someone would go into like explaining like homozygous and heterozygous, and I'm like, okay, well, come on, I knew that. Like, we're all in the same, we're all genetics majors. Like, but I think things have gotten so much better, and there's so much community for women in STEM. And I think it's just kind of day by day working to prove yourself and working to have a place in a field that is, you know, that gender has no effect on.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm glad that we have a network of people here at Rutgers of women that can like support each other in research, and that there are like things in place where you can find that community. It's been really helpful. Is there any other aspect of your identity that feels like it intersects with research and sort of shapes it in a different way?
I think my previous interest in like health and healthcare has kind of aided me in research, because a lot of the things that we're doing in research can have like immediate impact on healthcare and on like medications, or just understanding diseases or you know, mechanisms within the body more. And I think that's something that maybe a lot of people who are interested in any aspects of healthcare, whether that be like PA, dentistry, medical school, don't really think about. Like you think of research as like, oh, dealing with genes or like DNA sequencing, or just dealing with like rats and mice. But this is all really like being done for a reason. So I think that's something that like also plays into my love of research, because I could think like of the kind of downstream effects of how this is going to help or like save the lives of like real people, real patients one day.
Yeah, thank you. That's very inspiring. And I think that's what makes research so exciting, not just discovering new things, but also just how much potential those things have to be able to change lives and, you know, just improve the world as we know it. And I think that's such a wonderful like quality of researchers and people who love and who are just dedicating their lives and their careers to this. So um, it's very inspiring and uplifting to talk about. And thank you for sharing your story with us here today.
Thanks for talking to us. This is really interesting.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Same. It's very, it was really good to learn about your story and your journey and to share it with the podcast.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I think this podcast is a great opportunity in general, for also to like not only find a community of people who do research, but for kind of new people to get an idea of what research is. Like, I think I'm so happy to be able to talk to you guys today.
And that being said, always remember that you've got potential, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you guys.